Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Raskin from Maryland, and I want to thank my other colleagues also who are here today to shine a light on the abuses that happened last weekend, with the executive order that was passed and signed into law by this president. Mr. Speaker, this order is in direct contrast with the values that this country was built on. Foremost, to be a refuge. That is how so many people in the history of this country have come here. And instead, our president has chosen to close the doors on people fleeing violence in their home countries, and it is based on their religion. This ban is discrimination in its purest form. It does not make us safer. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I believe that doing what we did has actually put fodder into the hands of those who really do wish to do us harm by being able to say that America hates Muslims, that America hates Islam, that America hates immigrants and refugees, none of which is true to the history and the founding of this country. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that the International Rescue Committee has said that it is more challenging for refugees to get into the United States than anyone else. They are the most heavily vetted group there is. And as you can see here, I will have a chart here in just a second. As you can see, there are 20 steps involved in the process. And those who do get approved have been through the most rigorous background checks, fingerprinting, and questioning. Instead of making us safer, this ban is simply throwing people into chaos. Many of us over this last weekend went to our airports across the country, Dulles, New York, Seattle, Washington, my hometown. And we were called to the airport because there was chaos that erupted across the country, chaos that erupted at the airports because people who had legal documents to come to the United States were coming in and being told that the executive order meant that they no longer could actually stay here in this country. And Mr. President, what happened then for me, when I went to the SeaTac airport at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, I found a Somali family who had been waiting, a U.S. citizen woman who had been waiting to be reunited with her husband. She believed finally she was going to get to hold him in her arms. And instead, Mr. Speaker, what happened is that he was put on a plane and sent back to Heathrow, but perhaps somewhere else. We were not given any information about what was going to happen to that gentleman. And we found out that there were 2 additional individuals who were already put on a plane, ready to be deported. And we, along with the ACLU, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, our governor, we were able to file for a temporary restraining order, and we were able to take that restraining order on our phone to the plane and say, stop this plane. And that literally, Mr. Speaker, is how we were able to get those 2 people off of the plane. We were able to then get them legal counsel after much intervention. But, Mr. Speaker, it should not be this way. This is a country that was built by immigrants. It is a country that has welcomed people from across the world to come here as a refuge, as a sanctuary. My state of Washington is one of the top states in the country for refugee resettlement. And the reality is we are destroying the very principles of compassion, of humanity, of being a refuge, of building this country with immigrants and refugees. Literally thousands of people came to the airport to say, we welcome refugees, we welcome immigrants. This is not the America that we know and love. We are better than this. And this is not the first time I've had to fight for against these illegal deportations. After 9/11, we had similar situations, not as bad as this, but we had the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, NSEERS. And it required that 25 countries, men from 25 Muslim and Arab countries, to be fingerprinted and registered. This was under the Bush administration. And at the time, Attorney General John Ashcroft said, you're either with the terrorists or you're with us. That is a false choice, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that security and liberty do not oppose each other. They go hand in hand, and we cannot sacrifice one for the sake of the other. So, Mr. Speaker, we were able to fight that, and we finally did end that special registration program, but now here we are again. And we know the shame of history when we have not been on the right side of it. We know that in 1942, 125,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry were put into internment camps, and it took us a very long time to come back and apologize. But, Mr. Speaker, when we did, we said we will never do that again. And yet here we are, for the first time again, instituting a religious test as to who can get into this country. Let us be clear that it is a Muslim ban. It does not mean that every single Muslim across the world, every single Muslim country necessarily has been targeted yet. But what it does mean is that Muslims are being scrutinized in a different way simply for being Muslim. A constituent of mine called my office this week to tell me another very disturbing story, and she told me that I could tell it here on the floor. She was on her way back, passing through immigration into Houston, on her way back home to Seattle. Dr. Angelina Godoy was traveling back from Central America where she was doing research. She is a U.S. citizen. She said she was so alarmed by what happened to her that she wanted to call and get it on the record. Angelina is a human rights professor, and she has traveled through immigration many, many times. This was the first time, she said, she had experienced any of this. Her immigration officer asked her about her political views. When she said that she was deeply concerned about the president's actions, he asked her why she wasn't concerned with all the refugees that were flooding into our borders, and he used that word flooding. When she said she didn't think that they were flooding in, he told her that she can't tell him that based on the fake news she is seeing on television. Mr. Speaker, this is incredibly disturbing. Are we going to now check the views of every U.S. citizen who's coming into our borders to see whether they agree with these executive orders or not? Well, I'm here to tell you that it may be the thought that fear and patriotism together is the way to suppress dissent. We will not be suppressed with fighting for the very values that make us great. In cities around the country, what gives me hope is that people stood up to stand up against this hatred. The Muslim ban is unconstitutional, and we are standing here today to demand that it be repealed. And you can see here the chart that I referred to earlier. There are 20 steps that you must go through in order to be screened. Syrian refugees are probably the most screened individuals in our country today. And there are 5 million Syrian refugees who are pouring out of the country. Mr. Speaker, this is not a time to turn our backs on them. This is a time to make sure that we are taking care of the women, the children, the families, the majority of refugees to this country who are women and children and families, the majority who have family members here that they are waiting to be reunited with. That is who we are talking about, Mr. Speaker.